Hello and welcome to the Raisina Ideas Pod. My name is Aakanksha Tangri. The virtual world is an extension of the real, and online spaces often reflect and intensify the gender-based inequities we face offline. But amidst this, how are some women striking back and reclaiming their narrative? How are they telling their stories? And what is the power and the role of storytelling? Is there space for positive stories about women, or do we all have to pander to a certain narrative to be taken seriously? I'm joined by Sara Wahedi, the founder and CEO of Ehtesab, which is an app which provides real-time emergency information to residents in Afghanistan. Sara is amplifying not only her own story, but that also of millions of Afghan women and children living under the Taliban regime. Sara, thank you for being here and, more importantly, for the work you do.
Thank you so much for having me, Aakanksha, and to Raisina for allowing me to come today.
In recent years, whenever there's been a civil uprising or a conflict, we're seeing more and more women at the forefront of digital activism. How are Afghan women reasserting and reclaiming their identities and taking power of their narrative since the Taliban's takeover in 2021?
Right. So once the Taliban came into power, I believe that Afghan women and girls realized that there had to be an innovative way that they raised their voices worldwide, because there was a concern that since they weren't being seen in schools and workplaces anymore, that their voices would be erased. And what we saw was post August 15th, when the Taliban came to power, we saw protests in the streets, but also protests online of women holding up banners, singing songs of protest, creating hashtags on Twitter, using digital technology as a way to protest. And they continue to do so because they do understand that there is a systematic process of erasure that's happening in Afghanistan right now. And I've been inspired to see that regardless of the Taliban's policies to essentially cause gender apartheid, we're really seeing Afghan women utilize technology in the most innovative ways. And also, I've also seen a concerted effort by women to really reach out to member states, activists, leaders, not just in Afghanistan, but across the world, especially with the UN and many other platforms, and saying, please uplift and elevate our voices. And I always have, dozens of messages from Afghan women, not just telling me their stories, but making sure that I'm also responsible for elevating whatever I can. So there's a lot of different ways that they're utilizing technology. But I also think that it's this understanding that technology really has become a catalyst for protest and change.
But like with many conflicts around the world, when they play out, we see an information war playing out at the same time, right? And with recent events in the Middle East and with what's happened in Afghanistan, we're seeing that as well. With the propaganda come the memes, the reels, content that can go viral. So essentially all the propaganda that can actually cut through actual information and, sort of take charge or take control of the narrative. We've seen the Taliban use social media in an attempt to almost whitewash, legitimize, and humanize themselves. Considering that it's been almost 3 years in now, and, you've seen how Afghan women have taken charge of their narrative, but do you think that the West has let you down, let you and other Afghan women down, and your stories?
That's a great question. I think the thing that's left me the most disconcerted about the whole situation is there is a rampant campaign of misinformation and disinformation by the Taliban. And the international community is at a crux. They're really confused as to how to maintain some sort of connection with Afghanistan while working around the de facto regime, which is the Taliban. But what's happening is we're seeing, for example, yesterday, 2 men were executed in Ghazni province. We're seeing in stadiums and public executions. And also today, the announcement that girls over the age of 10 years old can no longer go to school. So there is a lot of really alarming information that's coming out of Afghanistan, but at the same time, the international community isn't willing to step up and also protect those fundamental human rights that they stand for, but have that hypocritical stance with Afghanistan. And I find that really difficult because Afghanistan, up until the de facto regime, was a part of the United Nations, a signatory for many of these human rights laws and regulations. And I do see that hypocrisy, and I don't see that going anywhere. I think that the international community is really confused as to how to move forward. But at the same time, I always impress that the international community has spent 2 decades investing in women's education, in economic growth, human rights, and now we're seeing a complete reneging of that and really stepping away. And also, I remind people that Afghanistan had 30% women in the parliament in terms of women, and also 400 acting judges, women judges in Afghanistan, who've all now escaped. So these are important points to consider, but also just to remember that the international community had a huge investment in all of these movements and growths in terms of human rights and the prosperity of women at that time.
But now do you think that somebody else's story matters more? And who decides whose story is more important?
Right. Of course. I think that Afghanistan has always struggled in terms of the news cycle. Right after was the Ukraine, and then currently the crisis in Gaza. And that continues to happen. I think that it's also this concern that Afghanistan continues to be in the news cycle, and it's become a bit of a bore, to be honest, for people. Afghanistan.
And that's sad.
It is sad.
Yeah.
And the heartbreaking thing is, like I said, is the Taliban didn't come out of nowhere. The growth of the Taliban, it was very clear for a few years that the situation in Afghanistan was deteriorating quite quickly. And many of us had been ringing the alarm bells during that initial time when the 2019, 2020 Doha talks were happening, of many of us ringing the alarm that, if the Taliban comes back into power, we're going to see a return to the first regime of women not being able to go to school, not going to work. And we're seeing step by step the Taliban bringing back those laws, but in a very slow process because they don't want to shock the international community. And in that, being lost in the news cycle, we're seeing Afghanistan return back to the dark ages.
So do you then think that there's a certain narrative that you and other Afghan women have to sort of, pander to or fit into to be taken seriously, to have your stories be at the forefront of the news cycle and not almost like, oh, great, well, here's Afghanistan again?
Right. And there's 2 points here. One is that there is an inclination to not take women who have confidence in their capacity to speak. I think that there is a little bit of an Orientalist perspective in terms of us having to pander in terms of begging and looking weak as Afghan women. And I always want to remind the international community that that's not who we are. We don't have to beg, and we're not going to beg. And we expect this same type of respect and expectation in terms of the fact that we also respect fundamental human rights. And I find that hypocrisy in terms of Afghanistan being able to be pushed aside compared to so many other countries who hold those fundamental human rights at the helm is quite frustrating. So I do find that sometimes because I'm able to speak eloquently or confidently, sometimes people forget that I am an Afghan woman, but I believe that I also hold a responsibility to my fellow Afghan women that I'm able to speak and share their message in a way that's going to be taken seriously, but also doesn't disrespect us as women, because alongside myself, there's so many other women who are incredibly strong and brave, but I don't believe that we have to be, harking to this kind of image of the, this Afghan woman in desperate need. I don't think that that's the solution.
I want to talk about your work also and bring that in. You're at the intersection of social impact, tech, and storytelling, right? In what ways can storytelling be used to dismantle the systemic barriers that women face in male-dominated spaces, both online and offline?
Well, for me, in terms of the way that I tell the story of Ehtesab, my startup, but also the work that I'm doing in terms of bringing to light what's happening in Afghanistan, especially with Afghan women and girls, is I liked to pick out a few Afghan women and girls specifically in my briefs or speeches or panels. And the reason for that is I find that when I walk away from them, people come up to me and say, I loved hearing about Tahmina, I loved hearing about Sadaf or Sahar or whoever it may be. And I find that those stories stick with people rather than me just using data and statistics. And those things are important. But I think when we're talking about human rights and this heartbreaking loss of what Afghan women and girls have gone through, using those stories are names that we can empathize. Like, they can be a girl that we perhaps know by name or someone that we can actually imagine. And for me, when I first started speaking about my work, I found that people would have like a, kind of a shadow over their eyes when I talk about numbers and policy and tech. And the light bulb moment for me was just sharing very specific stories that people
It's really
could empathize with.
humanizing them and reminding people that these are just real names and people behind the stories that you're seeing playing out on social media and in the news cycle.
Exactly. And I find that now whenever I speak to Afghan women and girls in Afghanistan, I always tell them to focus on their story, not just we've lost our rights. And those are things that everyone knows, but specifically, what is it that you lost? Was it that you were in grade 12, you were just about to graduate and you weren't able to finish? And I think that that's really where we see that elevation in terms of taking a pause and really understanding that humanity in this grave situation.
Do you think there's less appetite and consumption for positive stories about women in general?
Definitely. I find that we are kind of bored in terms of success stories. We, for some reason, as a society, are obsessed and drawn towards stories of desperation and frustration. And I still don't know the reason why that is. But I do find that whenever I see stories on Twitter, for example, or Instagram that are about a woman suffering, it goes viral much quicker than a story about a woman
particularly
succeeding.
Women from the global south or the developing world, as they refer to us.
There's this discomfort, I think, still in terms of the Western world of women from the global south succeeding and being quite strong. I find that it just doesn't really make sense or compute for them.
Yeah.
They might think, she might be an elite, or she was, she studied abroad.
There's the savior complex, or they don't know how to grapple with if they don't have to save us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's the notion of a woman from the global south being able to stand on her own ground and succeed without the need of sort of Western sentiments or platforms is still something that many people don't take seriously.
And because we're seeing, so many women get online, unfortunately, it's still a landscape where men are dominating technology as gatekeepers, right? From the tech companies to the policymakers to those who are deciding how our online behavior and what we're going to consume. A lot of those gatekeepers are men. For women to successfully reclaim their online identities, how do you envision, or what's your vision for a feminist tech policy?
I've seen a lot of the FANG companies in action in terms of being in meetings or panels with them. And I find that women are still a tokenistic example in terms of policy, especially in women who actually work in these spaces. I still don't feel a concerted intentional effort to think about women and women's a place in technology. I find that it's still that check marker or checkbox that we're trying to fill in terms of technology of, is there a woman on the board? Is there a woman, working in tech policy or in terms of, gender-based violence policies? And I still find that it's not this intentional type of technology that we need. And it shouldn't just be a benchmark or a stat of, how many women should be on these boards, but it should really be women being able to lead and govern specifically these realms. It shouldn't be man plus a woman on the side. Yeah. It really needs to be an intentional effort of having women at the helm and saying, we have this, we're going to lead. We'll let you know what we've come up with. And we're still seeing women take the back seat, in my opinion, especially in terms of the leading companies that lead tech.
And unfortunately, we have a long way to go. But the final question I want to ask you before I let you get back to the Raisina Dialogue is, what advice would you give a woman who's just starting out and wants to understand how she can successfully navigate the online landscape and share her story?
I would say that your story is not going to come across perfectly the first time. It's going to take some trial and error. And you're going to need to be able to refine your story in a way that's digestible. And sometimes that means you're going to have to perhaps, cut things down a little bit or make it seem a little bit more interesting for people. And that's just because of the fact that our current generation in the world just has a very low attention span. And it just means that every story that we share has to take that extra moment to be intentional in terms of the way that we share that.
Has
It's
to
not
have
same.
the ability to go viral.
Exactly.
You know,
it has to be
latest
short,
music,
sweet. Yeah.
You can be in a war zone, but, you know, just put some nice music over it.
Exactly.
And the perfect filters, and people will.
And we're seeing that in Gaza. I
Yeah.
mean, just like the citizen journalists that have come out from there, it's amazing how they're very just clear cut in terms of what they want to share, and just no BS, just very clear. And that's what we need to do. It needs to be like exactly how you said, it's not pandering anymore, being direct, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Sara, thank you so much for sharing your story and for the work you do and for speaking with me. We hope you've enjoyed the Raisina Dialogue, and we look forward to welcoming you in New Delhi next year.
Thank you so much, Aakanksha.